Hi, everybody, and welcome to SCRUM and video game project management, ingredients of a successful love drama. I'm Stefana Fromea. I will be your guide through this journey into SCRUM, agile method, video game production, and all that jazz. So no need to waste more time. We can go straight away into the main topic. So one second. Okay, here we are. So, ingredients of a successful love drama. Just before we start, a short introduction on my side. I'm Stefana Fromea. As aforementioned, I was a former psychologist, 8 years as researcher and clinical psychologist in various institutions. And then I did a job conversion to become a producer. 4 years in the serious game field, 5 years in AA studio in Germany, and since a bit more than 1 year, I am producer on flight sim at Asobo in France. I would say in heroic fantasy, I would give the closest character to a mage warrior with these balanced roles. No, in terms of method, because this is also one of the topics we are going to discuss today. What is my methodology background? As I have just mentioned, I was a researcher in psychology and criminology. I have also a PMP certification since 2014. For the ones who don't know this, this is a method of methods. This is a topic we will discuss shortly later. It's about the framework in order to make things happen in a way. In terms of agile method, I am pretty fond of SCRUM, even though I have no certification in this regard. But this is also a point we will discuss later. The fact that I have no formal SCRUM certification is actually a good asset in order to talk about it. This is a specific point we will develop. So, SCRUM approach and video game project management. Let's start with the nice things about this, the honeymoon. And some basics about video game. As we all know, it's about iteration to feed creativity. And it's about a media which is non-linear, requiring lots of effort, joint effort, and mainly multidisciplinary, which is pretty awesome and crazy, but implies also lots of communication and lots of ideas to move forward, as well as it has to answer and to address some, let's say, strong expectations in terms of time, cost, and quality, of course. In other words, we could say that video game production is not that much of getting the right idea or good ideas, because we know lots of people with crazy ideas, but it's about the means to make it happen. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint, actually, even though we are going to discuss about what is a sprint later. So at the end of the day, method and methodology is required. But SCRUM, because SCRUM is no kind of a big standards in our industry, and whatever the size of the studio or company you are working for. It was created in the mid-80s in a non-video game related context, and it has been applied since then, of course, on video game, but not only, on plenty of other product development, mainly softwares. This so-called method is pretty good for innovation, for incrementing things, for giving and pushing visibility on a work in process. It's a simple framework for complex development. Long story short, it's about getting a daily routine with specific processes giving oneself a time in order to produce something on which we will iterate. And between two iterations, we can revamp, we can update the backlog of the same product. So it's a pretty strong approach in this regard and based on iteration expectation. And of course, according to this, it has some specific values promoted, like courage, focus, commitment, respect, openness. What you have to keep in mind, if you are not already aware about this, is that this process, this approach, this method is maybe less flexible as it could sound with agile, because A, it's focused on group dynamics, B, in order to make something real happen. So if we do a quick recap, on the one hand, we have what the video game needs: joint effort, iteration, keeping the scope and the content under control, and empirism. It has to exist at the end of the day. And on the other side, you have the Scrum benefits. Scrum, literally, it means people together, a strong togetherness. Of course, this iterative approach I have just described, the fact that it involves the client, which should, in theory, decrease significantly the delta or the risk of gap between what was expected and what will happen at the end. And also, according to this, a working application. We need to see what is produced. So at the end of the day, and at first sight, video game and Scrum, yeah, it has everything of a true love case. But if it's too nice to be true, maybe it's not true. And no, we have to focus on the love drama aspect of this love story. And it has to be linked with the video game specifics. Because if we are talking about video game industry, we are talking about companies. And for this, we can distinguish globally three categories of companies. Of course, we have the indie developers, small and flexible, small teams, projects, budgets, and flexible in terms of deadline, at least as long as you have money for your project. Then you have double A, medium, big, bigger team, bigger budget, less flexibility, innovation. The scope is most often given and the time pretty rigid. The double A means, the next step is the triple A, and by extension, the 4 A's. We are talking about huge teams, even sometimes co-development with studios on different countries. Time and budget in this regard could be problematic, but are rarely a problem because the focus is on quality. But for the same reason, the scope can explode. So, on the one hand, we have indie with a pretty good scope in terms of iteration. The perfect team size for Scrum, it's a small team, but low budget, and we can really question the Scrum baselines. Then we have a double A. The team size is still okay. We can split the team, we can organize a bit more effort, but this is still something that can match the Scrum approach. The time is hard to move. The lines are pretty fixed. The scope, it's pretty hard to afford to move this. And in terms of budget, it's pretty often or always a given one with but a specific business case with no room for change. And again, same problem. The team is bigger, so we can really question or educated in terms of Scrum the people and the stakeholders are. And on the other hand, the AAA or 4As configuration with, okay, time and budget pretty open for iteration, with the risk or at the expense of the scope most of the time. The team size is pretty gigantic and not compatible with Scrum at first sight. And again, no, the size is so big that the baselines in terms of Scrum are really challenging, to say the least. So after this pretty nice start, what we can see is that we have a different set of constraints and one common Scrum requirement missing, that is to say, people knowing what is Scrum and how to use Scrum and used to the vocabulary and the wording and the concepts of Scrum. In other words, there is a strong need to evangelize. So need to take some time on top of what is planned for the project. In terms of reservation, video game needs joint endeavor, iteration, scope under control, and empirism, or even pragmatism. The Scrum benefits, okay, we can work together pretty close, we can iterate pretty often, we involve the partners and the client, and we will give ourselves the mean of what we want with a working application. But the video game specifics are pretty challenging. The team size can vary in a very wide way from one company to another one. There will be always deadlines, milestones to enforce and respect, and the scope can go from something pretty fixed to absolutely non-defined. On top, we are pretty sure that in any companies, there will be a strong need to educate people at what is Scrum in order to avoid some easy traps. Like Scrum is improvisation. No, actually, Scrum is not improvisation. That means at the end of the day that the reality of a video game studios and the demanding nature of Scrum on the reverse of what it could seem imply that we are more in a limited scope of feasibility and in the illusion of a method rather than an achievement in this regard. And most of the time, at least related to my experience, studios claim they are using Scrum without using Scrum because they don't know or the environment doesn't allow them to do so. So it's no more the love at first sight situation, but more the arranged marriage case. Does it mean we need to give up? Necessarily not. There is always a workaround and a trade-off. And actually, it's not because Scrum by the book doesn't fit exactly the video game context, but everything is to throw away. But for sure, there is a risk of studio collapse or production dangers there, because what I have just described is the fact that most of the time we are claiming to use a method which is not systematically relevant in a context which is not appropriate, based on the lack of expertise, yes, unfortunately, leading to bad habits and wrong practices, even without the awareness of it, and based on the very initial will to reassure everybody, like hell is paved with goodwill. In other words, there is a need for alternative ways and workarounds. And there are some tips in this regard. The first one about acceptance. And this is exactly what we are doing in a way. It means that, of course, Scrum is demanding, but in a way, and everybody does so actually, there is no need to stick to Scrum by the book at any cost. We can refer to Scrum because this is, let's say, a common reference. But everybody liking Scrum doesn't mean that everybody knows Scrum. And since it's an open secret, the best thing to do is still to accept to do Scrum by yourself, and then to identify the different parameters I have mentioned just before, the set of constraints. What are the habits of a studio in terms of method? What is the flexibility in terms of expertise of educating, training people? What is the history of a studio in this regard? Related to a project, is there already a budget, a timeline, etc., etc., etc. It's about spotting all the parameters and start to claim the Scrum adjustment needs in your situation, not just importing Scrum as it is and trying to paste it on an already existing organization, but trying to merge the best of it with the existing and identifying the resistances. Then ends the second tip, adaptation. We have just to remember the main benefits of Scrum, and we are going to develop them. It's about values and it's about tools. In this regard, we have to be picky. What I mean this way is that since we have to choose the best related to our environment, which is also related to the size of a team, the size of a project, the configuration of a company, the category of a company, the market targeted, etc., 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 you will have to choose the right fight or the right parameters within the Scrum method, and to pair it with the right means. That is to say, the toolbox, the Scrum toolbox. You have to take your pick, in other words. Concrete. It is okay, definitely, with Scrum, whatever the environment is. Sticking to Agile manifesto, that is to say, highlighting the people rather than the processes, getting a working application, accepting the changes, and working with a client, a close collaboration. This is okay. This is a strong asset in order to, let's say, support a vision. What is also good is that it can help to focus on the team dynamics, the group dynamics. Scrum is really about this togetherness. And on top, we will see with the tools, you can also aim for short and mid-term visibility. These goals are provided by the Scrum method and by the tools we are going to see, and are totally fine whatever the context is. What is definitely less relevant is to try to use Scrum really by the book and to go full or pure iteration, which is somehow at the opposite of the life cycle of a video game, which is, let's say, most of the time a Y cycle. Lots of iteration in the very beginning to define the core mechanics, then the first prototype. Once this is safe and secured, going into more kind of a waterfall approach in order to get the first visibility, iterate less and less on some parameters, no jeopardizing or trying not to compromise the existing core game loop, etc., 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 to deliver the game at the end. You can go pure iteration, but in a really specific cases. R&D, porting, if you are working on a new technology, but otherwise, there is no need to reinvent the wheel in this regard. Or you are in the situation of Blizzard 10, 20 years ago with unlimited budget, and this is okay. Another trap which should not be disregarded is the team size. Yeah, 6 people, 2 times 6 people, etc., etc., but not 120, 150. Scrum is not thought and not created for this kind of size and measures. But if you want to hire an army of project managers and to refactor all the institution you are working, but the values and the goals was one thing, and now the means to get there. Super easy things to use with a bit of training and education in the beginning. Daily stand-up meeting, review and retrospective, the Scrum poker planning, different roles, the vision owner, the responsible for the method, the developers, backlog, really important. So little documentation, lots of communication, and dedicated time and space to make it happen. We are talking about building long-term through short-term. And this is okay. We have secured the day, the man, but we are not really talking about the long-term visibility and guidance, schedule, cost, milestones. Hence, the third tip related to the guidelines and the need to combine with other methods. Once an agile routine is set, there is necessarily a need for complementary approaches and monitoring. As I have said, the monitoring and the complementary approach maybe would not be required if we could apply Scrum by the book entirely, which is not the case. So with, let's say, only part of Scrum used, it will be, there will be some blanks and some holes to fill, hence the need for complementary approaches. And with my experience, I would go for two main approaches. For KPIs, the PMI approach. This is the certification I was mentioning in the very beginning of the speech, for the mid-long-term visibility. And the more, let's say, basic and efficient make it happen approach to enforce deliveries and to close the project, waterfall. At some point, we switch to this naturally, because at the end of the day, we will have to deliver. Again, the idea is to leave nobody and nothing behind this way. A quick word on the PMBOK, which is the Bible, the book of knowledge from the PMI approach. I am talking about the PMI approach because I am certified in this one, but I could have mentioned Prince2, Six Sigma, and so forth and so more. There is a large, let's say, variety of methods and tools you can use in order to find the good match with your use of Scrum. Kanban method, etc. The lean approach. You have also servant management. It could be a full presentation in order to explore all the opportunities in terms of methodology. What is good with this approach is that you can go through lots of processes, process groups, knowledge areas, and you can adjust them related to other methods. As I have mentioned in the beginning, the PMI approach and the PMP certification, it's about a method of a method. So it's totally okay and compatible with lots of other. There is no parasiting or no interference between them. But again, which is not okay, is that it's not about enforcing a methodology to the letter. It's not doing by the book, but again, picking the right fights in order to find the right and the smooth balance between methodologies. Otherwise, you will end up in spending your time updating Excel's projects or preparing a presentation and not actually working on the project. And you will be tempted to hire an army of producers to create the illusion of safety by update of documents. Updating documents, it's totally fine, but it's not the ultimate goal. Short example of 10 processes I have used and I keep using for some of them. 10 within the 49 likely to be used. You can decrease this to 3 if you are alone. You can go to 10 if you have 2 associate producers. Again, it's a question of an intuitive application of them with a good match with the existing method you have picked, if this is a Scrum, and what are the most convenient to give you the visibility on the long term and on the good run of your project. Or as I have written, it's about safeguards processes in order to secure the progression through indexes. I will not go into details, but it's just to give you kind of an idea. The project charter is the idea of a project. The scope statement is an agreement with the client about the contents you want to enforce. Of course, milestone delivery list. It's most of the time even contractual parameter. You will have KPIs, that is to say, schedule performance index, cost performance index, etc., etc. Things complicated, things easy. Again, the main thing is that since your environment will be really wide with various parameters, you have to adjust your method with the same accuracy and to pick the right tool for the right visibility. So at the end, it's not the love at first sight, but a combination of convenient tools, the SCRUM for the group dynamics and the short-term mastery, PMI, Prince2, or any other method in order to set processes, to spot interdependencies, and to keep a good visibility on the long term, and waterfall to enforce work sequences and match specific discipline workflow. For instance, Scrum is not really thought and useful for artists, for animation, for mocap. For these disciplines, for these departments, you have something which is pretty well defined with a beginning and an end, and you have just to go through the workflow. You have just to respect the pipeline. We are no more talking about Scrum by the book, but by the tools. And this can be encapsulated in a flow of processes. You have just to pay attention to make them the less intrusive possible. So there is no love at first sight, and it's not a arranged marriage, but we could consider that it's a marriage of convenience at the end. And I thank you for your attention.